I'm Jack Erickson with Veterans for Peace, Chapter 46 here in Monterey, California. It's Christmas in Monterey, and today we are having a special event about a Christmas 102 years ago during war, the Christmas Truce of 1914. And here next to me is Steve Bradford, a member of Veterans for Peace, Chapter 46. Steve, tell us what you're going to talk about today, the Christmas Truce.
Hi, I'm Steve Bradford, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the first Christmas of the First World War.
And give us a little background, please.
Well, the First World War was unique. It was the first war of the technological era of the Industrial Revolution. It had a level of commitment of manpower, horses, and weaponry, unlike anything the world had ever seen before. And there was a brief moment at the beginning of the first 4 months into the war, during which soldiers on both sides of the trench lines communed with one another at Christmas, on Christmas Eve and on Christmas Day. And we Veterans for Peace, just want to recognize that spirit and say, in the midst of all of the horrible things that happened, there was a moment of humanity, and we wanted to just acknowledge it and wish each other a Merry Christmas.
Thank you. And that was when German troops came out of the trenches and they met French, Belgian, and English troops, and some of them spoke each other's language. They traveled there, they studied each other, and they realized how much in common they had and why were their leaders telling them they had to kill each other. So, Steve, we're looking forward to our talk. And do you have a final word?
I do have a final word. In fact, I have a final image. This is trench warfare in the mud of winter, collapsing, trench foot, constantly wet. If you stick your head up, there's a blizzard, if you will, of steel from machine guns and artillery. And you live in these conditions, and then it snows. And so I just wanted to emphasize how horrible that experience was. We, as Veterans for Peace, would like to emphasize the idea that war should be a last resort amongst nations. We've lived through periods when it was a preemptive option, and we don't think that that should be the case, that we should try to work things out first.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to your presentation. Well, hello and welcome. I'm Jack Erickson. I am with Chapter 46, Veterans for Peace, here in Monterey, California. And we're having another event. VFP has been holding several events on educational, informative events for the community as well as for veterans. And today is a little different. This is education, but also social. It's the 6th of December, and we are doing a presentation tonight about the Christmas Truce of 1914. And I will have Steve Bradford give a presentation on that. First of all, I'd like to tell you, we are at Turn 12 Restaurant, which is a well-known restaurant, bar, dining club here in Monterey. And I had to ask, what does Turn 12 mean? And they looked at me like, you don't follow racing, do you? And I said, no, I don't follow racing. Monterey is also the home of Laguna Seca, a very famous raceway out on Highway 68. And there are 11 turns there, but no turn 12. So just like golf has the 19th hole where everybody goes after the 18th hole, turn 12 is the last curve that you go to after the race. So as I look around, I see all these classic old racing cars that look like from the 40s or 50s. Bugattis, Maseratis, Ferraris, and all sorts of cars I've never seen it before, but the pictures are just stunning. It's like a movie set here. And you see one of the sports cars back there. So our event today is also a charitable event. And we are raising some, we're having people bringing food for the Silicon Valley, for the Salinas Valley Food Bank. So I would like to introduce Steve Bradford, who is a member of Veterans for Peace, Chapter 46. And Steve will make a brief presentation today on the Christmas Truce of 1914. Truly one of the really touching stories that came out of the Great War. Steve?
Yeah, it's just on the camera. It's not video.
Well, thanks, you guys. Thanks very much for coming to hear about 10 minutes of what happened 100 years ago, and then some during the First World War. I'm going to pass out a few photographs. There are, on the screen behind me, images of trench warfare. In World War I, trench warfare was a distinguishing characteristic of the First World War. There are a couple of things that made that war different from every war that preceded it in human history, but the trench system was its defining characteristic. So I'm going to pass out a few things that have to do with the extent of the trenches, 470 miles, with what life in a trench looked like, and with a little bit of the chronology of the first 4 months of the war, from August until December of 1914. So bear with me a moment. I mentioned that trenches were something that separated this war from every preceding war in human history. The other thing, obviously, is that this happened for the first time under the auspices of the Industrial Revolution, during which populations had moved from the countryside to the cities, where millions of workers could be impressed into the armed forces and sent via rail to the battlefields, and the telegraph communications could organize these big movements of people. And so when war came about in Europe in 1914, there was a transfer of people and equipment and munitions, combined with the revolution in the means of warfare, the machine gun, the breech-loading rifled artillery, not to mention mustard gas, the airplane, and submarines. So the armies rushed at each other on the Western Front. The Germans rushed into France through Belgium, trying to flank the French armies and to take Paris, which they thought would end the war in short order. And they ran into stiff opposition, and as you can see from the photograph of what happened with the trenches, they ended up having a stalemate for about 470 miles from the Swiss border up through France to Belgium and then to the coast. So it was an amazing thing. Some of the trenches that you see on the screen behind you, because the trenches didn't really move much in 4 years, and they improved them, and they put planking on the floor, and they were able to put steel reinforcements to keep the walls from simply collapsing in the winter with the rain and the snow and the mud. But in this first winter of 1914, the first winter of the war, they didn't have all those improvements, and the millions of people who were living in this trench system, when it rained, the walls collapsed. They were in the mud. Their feet just kind of deteriorated. There's something called trench foot. The barrage of steel in the air from the artillery and the machine guns and the rifles that impelled them to go down in the first place, made it a very dangerous environment. And what we're here today to recognize is a brief moment of peaceful interaction between a number of the soldiers who faced each other across the trenches. This is after a big battle at the Marne. At this point, already 400,000 Frenchmen were casualties of the war. The French weren't so inclined to collaborate with the Germans and to fraternize with them, because they had lost 44 years earlier. They had lost the Franco-Prussian War and lost Alsace and Lorraine to the Germans. The Belgians weren't inclined to fraternize with the Germans, because as the German armies came through Belgium, the thing that made the Germans apprehensive was the idea that Belgian resistance among the civilians and the soldiers who had hidden in the wash of the advancing German armies, would slow down their plan to sweep and take Paris. So they killed civilians. At one point, they killed 400 of them in one incident, 66 in another. Very mean-spirited, punitive terror campaign. And the citizens of Belgium weren't inclined to be friendly with the Germans, but the British were, and for good reason. The war had just begun. There had been such a long period of peace in Europe. Heck, the Kaiser was the grandson of Queen Victoria, and he held the rank of admiral in the British Navy. He spent an awful lot of time in Britain and spoke English as good as any other Englishman. The trenches meant that the troops were often within 50 to 100 yards of one another. You could see them. That means the snipers could shoot at them, of course, but it also means you could hear them. And what happened in the German lines on Christmas Eve is what the Germans do is they sing Christmas carols and they light their Christmas trees. And they put candles on top of these, on the branches, and they put them up on the parapets of their lines. And they were singing their German Christmas carols, the ones that we know, such as Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, which goes, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, da 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 da. Anyway, so the Brits knew what that was. And their favorite song, too, O Tannenbaum, which we call O Christmas Tree. O Tannenbaum, da 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 da. Anyway, so they're singing over here. There are lights showing that it's Christmas. I might remind you, as you know, but I'm a master of stating the obvious. They were all celebrating the birth of the same Prince of Peace, God, that they shared in common. And they hadn't been so far removed from peace that they'd forgotten what their homes were like and the last Christmas that they'd spent. And it made them just a little emotional. And the invitations to collaborate came mostly from the Germans. For example, they were shouting out Merry Christmas to the Brits. The Brits responded, unlike most of the French and the Belgians. And what we found across a long part of this trench system were troops on Christmas Eve coming out of their trenches and advancing and not being shot at in most cases. And the next day, on Christmas Day, there was kind of a general they'd make the effort to come out and see if they're going to be shot at, and then the troops met in a no man's land, and they shared some gifts with each other, and they talked, and they sang songs. A couple of them kicked a soccer ball around, and then they did the more necessary work that they needed to do, which is collect the dead, many of whom had lain there for a week or two because you couldn't go out there to get them. And the nature of warfare at that time being that when an offense was ordered, the troops would come up over the parapets and run and get mowed down by the machine guns and the artillery, and they would just lie there. So they agreed amongst themselves that they would do that necessary job, and they honored each other's dead. That was a big deal to soldiers. And that was it. It was for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, 1914. There's been an awful lot written about it. You've seen representations in the media, and sometimes it's made more of than it was. The General Staff of the British Army put an immediate halt to any kind of fraternization in the future, and then it was over. But a brief flicker. It was like a matchstick in the face of a hurricane of total war. And I think we really should remember them and honor them and wish them a Merry Christmas.
How many troops do you think were really involved in this peace? How many troops do you think really participated in that?
It happened along a couple of hundred miles of, so it's quite a few. Quite a few, yeah.
And then they went back and slaughtered each other the next day, right?
Well, it's interesting. In reading about this, I found that there was an awful lot of agreement amongst the people who were facing one another throughout the war, an agreement not to shoot if the other didn't, to allow them to come out and get their casualties, to But then, unfortunately for them, all of these poor soldiers, the only strategy of their commanders was to attempt yet once again for years to have the troops jump up and run across no man's land and try to take the dug-in defensive positions of their opponents. And unfortunately, the weapons of war in an industrial age favor the defense. So that's why this was so bloody. If you talk to an awful lot of, well, if you go to places in Britain and so forth, you'll find memorials to World War I, and you won't find memorials to World War II. The reason is that a whole generation of young men from all the European armies, all the European societies that participated in the war was lost. An entire generation. It was so much more. There were an awful lot of more civilians killed in World War II. That was probably a natural extension of total technological war, where we simply were able to target civilians, which we did, all of us. But in World War I, the number of young men that was killed far surpassed anything that happened in these local communities in World War II. Anyway, we should recognize it. It was just a moment of peace, a brief moment. What we're emphasizing here is that war is horrible. We should try to avoid it if we can. We Veterans for Peace, I know and I think we, would like to see war as a last resort, not a first resort. In particular, we'd not like to see it be the first resort of a preemptive war ordered by people who never served in the armed forces. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much for that very poignant, touching story about how humanity could come out in the midst of a war, and the soldiers on both sides could find out they had a lot in common together, and why were their leaders telling them they had to kill each other. My interest in World War I goes back to when I was at graduate school at Georgetown University. I was studying Russian studies and learning about the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. Well, you couldn't understand the Bolshevik Revolution unless you understood World War I. So I read a lot of books on it and learned all about the Great War, what a tragic, sad episode it was, that so millions and millions and millions of men had to die because of this crazy thing that they had all these alliances of all the monarchies that were all related. Later, and I was in Bruges, Belgium, about 20 years ago, and I was staying at kind of a little B&B place. It was very comfortable, very homey, and I was talking about my interest in history and all that, and a woman said, "Would you like to go to Flanders Fields?" So she told me the next day, about 20 minutes from Bruges, you start coming to these beautiful farm fields, and there were sheep out there and cattle and corn and wheat. And you'd come around a corner, and there would be a cemetery in the midst of a cornfield, and there'd be 500 graves, maybe 800 graves. Go a little further down the road, there's a little pasture. There's a smaller graveyard, maybe only 150. And you go over a hill, and there's another graveyard. Right in the middle of all the farmland were all of these graves from World War I. So sad that they had to bury the troops where they fell. And they still commemorate with cemeteries. 2 years ago, my wife and I took a tour of the Battle of the Somme, and we went to the Valley of the Somme, and we walked in the trenches. The trenches are still there. Of course, they're kind of molded over right now, but you can still walk through them, and they snake through the farmland there, through the countryside, and you can see the trees all around, and there were little markers where these soldiers fell, these soldiers fell, these soldiers fell. And we went to a museum, and the museum was a trench. You walk into a very nice museum building, pay your fee, and then you walk down these steps. You are in a trench. So you snake through this trench, and you can see where the clinics was, where the hospital was, where they had these beds stacked one on top of each other in dirt-walled rooms. And they had the area where they would feed people, and they'd have, a room for like 20 people to sit around a table and eat. And of course, they'd have a stove down there, an event. You just realize how punishing it would be to try to live under those circumstances for 4 years, and how dangerous and uncomfortable and filthy it was. It was just kind of one of those experiences like, how did they survive this? So that was my personal interest in this, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation today, and thank you very much from Veterans for Peace, Chapter 46.